Welcome back, and thanks again for staying with Africa News Network First Fast Live. My name is Cindy Mabi. The ANC's fifth policy conference is just a few days away, where the party will decide its policies for the next 5 years. You can join Africa News Network as we track the ANC in transition. Now, it's that time of the year when the ANC will be focusing on its policies in days to come, and of course also for the next 5 years. And one of the significant aspects of the policy conference is the party's stance on international relations. Now, ANN7 takes a closer look at the areas that need attention for South Africa to maintain its image as an African leader.
South Africa, a member country of Brics, has made its presence felt in the group, and its toll is growing. South Africa is alive to the changes in governments of the Brics partners, such as Brazil, and assesses how this could affect the cohesion in the forum in future.
South Africa is going to have to think quite carefully of how it positions itself vis-a-vis BRICS, and also in terms of what is best for South Africa's foreign policy in terms of trade policy and economic policy generally. South Africa's major trading partner is still the European Union. South Africa's trade with Europe far exceeds its trade with China, for example. Yet China has been positioned as one of South Africa's chief allies, despite the fact that China itself has been, both within BRICS and outside of BRICS, leveraging itself and its political diplomacy, as well as its economic diplomacy.
The focus will also be bilateral relations with its neighbors. DRC, Zimbabwe, Nigeria, and the diaspora here call for immediate attention, especially in light of the scattered xenophobic cases over the years.
President Kabila's visit to President Zuma is not necessarily very good for, the Congolese democracy. But, in saying so, the ANC documents would then point to the fact that we don't want to impose on Congo a solution, and President Zuma's visit, or President Zuma's acceptance of President Kabila, would be in that, more in that type of a milieu. So it's the struggle. We as South Africa generally claims, and the ANC, as you're looking at the policy document, talks about it as being or looking like it has been driven by human rights, but it's more an interest-based, solidarity-based foreign policy. And so the visit is in this context, and this is very unlikely to change, even though the current policy document looks very good.
Given that South Africa appears to be moving away from its leading role on the continent, particularly within the African Union, and seems to be moving away from using the continental and regional approach in its foreign policy, given that its focus has been largely on BRICS and its BRICS intervention and its intervention as a country rather than a region, that focus away from the continental approach means that possibly South Africa is going to be facing more and more xenophobic attacks in future, given that the perception is that South Africa is moving away from its approach of being unified with the continent.
South Africa and Zimbabwe share robust economic ties. With the elections in Zimbabwe approaching thick and fast, all eyes will be on South Africa for the future course of action.
The South African neighborhood to the north, Southern African neighborhood to the north, and particularly Zimbabwe, has been problematic for many years. And South African foreign policy, certainly in theoretical terms, has not changed on Zimbabwe. We had the so-called quiet diplomacy years of the Mbeki government that has been carried over somewhat into Mr. Zuma's administration. But given that Mr. Mugabe's administration in Zimbabwe has become increasingly authoritarian, and increasingly difficult for Zimbabwean citizens, again, South Africa is going to have to think very carefully about how its foreign policy ought to be handled towards Zimbabwe to best benefit not only South Africans, but the millions of Zimbabweans currently living in South Africa.
The ANC document is founded on the overarching principle of progressive internationalism. This is defined as a radical perspective of international relations that the liberation movement developed out of the struggle for liberation.
And joining us in studio, on the line, is Dr. Jackie Cilliers, Executive Director for the Institute for Security Studies, and Bruna Katumba is a legal advisor with the DRC, or Congolese Leaders Forum in South Africa. Kenny Madanza is a spokesperson for ZANU-PF, and Levindo is a political analyst. We'll start in studio. Good evening to you, gentlemen. Bonsoir.
Bonsoir, merci.
Ça va?
Yes, ça va bien, vous, madame?
Bien, merci.
Okay,
and that's as far as it goes. Thank you so much for joining us. I think let's just talk about what we heard from some analysts saying that it seems that South Africa, or there's a perception that South Africa is moving away from the rest of the continent, but primarily with the alignment with the Brics community as opposed to the Western nations. What is your view, Mr. Katumpa?
My view will be a bit controversial because viewing from the recent visit of President Kabila in South Africa, and then we are a little bit worried because it seems to be an habit from both sides to have agreement signed days before the big days of elections, which is really worrying because according to the statement that the president has made, it has really sent a shockwave in the Congolese community, because after violating the December agreement, it seems that South Africa unconditionally support President Kabila to the disagreement of the Congolese people. So it is like giving privilege to the relation than to the well-being of Congolese people, which is really, really questionable and regrettable for us.
Yeah, and I mean, foreign diplomatic relations are very delicate, and especially with taking into account the sovereignty of each state, or country rather, and what their needs are on the ground. Is South Africa, in your view, being viewed favorably, just from what Mr. Katumpa has said, Levi?
Well, I think it depends, Cindy, on what then becomes the priorities of South Africa and what then underpins the underlying factors that informs South Africa's foreign relations. But then what one has to look at, especially if you look at the policy conference now as is going on, the ANC as the ruling party talks about the unpredicted world, which will require a lot of realignment. But I think there is nothing wrong with South Africa having to decide on the path to take. And I think it has worried a lot of the Western countries, especially in the current administration, that the focus has been on the Brics and in the East. And obviously, those that were benefiting out of their relations with Africa has to get worried. But also, one has to observe the fact that South Africa seemed to attract a lot of foreign countries in relation to investment, and obviously jealousy has to exist in terms of where does South Africa is actually focusing on.
All right, let's ask Dr. Cilliers if it is indeed that sentiment that Africa, it's really about envy more than anything else. Dr. Cilliers, and how, especially with the ANC policy conference in dealing with Afrophobia, xenophobia that we've seen largely meted against fellow African brothers and sisters?
Well, there's no doubt that the xenophobic attacks have done South Africa's image in Africa a tremendous amount of damage. the African Union's Peace and Security Council has actually discussed this issue. And wherever you travel, and I travel a lot in Africa, I'm actually in Mozambique at the moment, people ask you about, is it safe for us to travel to South Africa? What is wrong with you people that you don't want other Africans in South Africa? So there is a lot of damage done. And then also the other issue that you've mentioned, that it seems that under President Zuma, our foreign policy has become much more enamored with the Brics, the BRIC countries, than it has with the rest of Africa. And of course, Africa is hugely important for South Africa. It is the one region, except for with the US, where South Africa has a positive trade balance, and our future lies in Africa. But I think that the reality is simply that for the next probably 2-3 years until 2019, when we have new elections, South Africa is going to probably be forced to look internally more than externally, because we have so many domestic challenges that I wondered to what extent we will really be able to play the leadership role that many other Africans look to South Africa. Clearly, the last few years, we've not been playing a clear leadership role in the continent for these reasons. We've been distracted by our internal challenges, by the impact of xenophobia, and our apparent focus on Brics rather than in Africa. And also there doesn't seem to be coherence in terms of what South Africa wants in Africa in recent years. And I think these are all issues that have an impact on how South Africa is perceived.
All right, Dr. Saliers, please stay on the line. Mr. Katumpa, is that perhaps a dream that has been deferred, that of an African renaissance that is self-reliant, self-sustained, and is more coordinated in its efforts to advance the continent? Do you think that South Africa in that aspect has not done enough in being the leader for that cause?
I think South Africa has done not what has been expected from it. Because remember, the main focus point of attention from the African people and country was the plight of South Africans during the apartheid years, which was a very gross violation of human rights, and under a minority government oppressing the majority and taking all the wealth for itself. But what is happening around, especially like in Africa, in DRC particularly, you see the same pattern repeating in DRC, and South Africa seems not to be on the side of those majority who were oppressed before, like South Africa. So in this, I'm saying that South Africa favored the peace and security to satisfy neighboring country more than the Congolese themselves. Since you can realize that in the past, wrongly, South Africa had been siding with a country like Rwanda, under the pretext of going after the Hutus. They find themselves toppling the Mobutu Sese Seko government, and now it is a trail of killings and to impose themselves on power. In Congo, killing, you have heard recently about the Kamwina Nsapu and the plight of the Kasai people. Over 1 million people have been displaced forcibly into Angola.
But yeah, we told the former AU chair, Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, that a lot of peace and stability was negotiated and achieved through the intervention of South Africa and other nations. And now we're hearing almost a contradictory.
No, I have to mention that we praise also South Africa because during the M23 movement, some of us, Congolese living in South Africa, we made South African government aware of the games played by Rwanda, and then in that awareness, they helped to neutralize the M23 movement. That was a good action. But we need South Africa to continue on that path, because they have to do what Africans have done for them. I mean, helping South Africa to be out of this oppressive government of minority trying to get all the wealth for themselves. In this case, we are talking about Rwanda and with complicity of Uganda and some multinational company.
Is there more to celebrate, you think, in terms of what the country has done for the rest of the continent?
I think in South Africa there's a lot to celebrate. The South Africa's intervention in a number of crisis areas in Africa is well documented.
Yes.
The transition in the DRC from the Mobutu Sese Seko regime to the current administration was actually took place because of the participation of South Africa. South Africa is busy intervening or has intervened in the crisis in Lesotho of late. And if you look at the underlying principles of South Africa's foreign policy, it talks about peace, it talks about stability, it talks about fighting against coup d'etats. And that is what South Africa has done. But there is an element from a number of sectors in Africa that seek to suggest that South Africa must then take a leading role in Africa and become the leader of all the states. But then South Africa cannot just do all these things because it is guided by laws. International law says you must respect the sovereignty of a state. Now, obviously, all states are supposed to be respected, and South Africa must observe that. And if there are conflicts that requires intervention, that is where you will need South Africa to come in and intervene.
Let's test the sovereignty of the state, Dr. Saliers. We saw with the International Criminal Court, with the South Africa and other African nations pulling out of that. Of course, there was a court action that was that reversed that particular Roman statute obligation that the country has. Do you think we're still grappling with finding solutions that will deal with the unique South African and continental issues?
Well, I think what is important to recognize is that South Africa, and you're referring to the ANC discussion document, subscribes very much to South-South solidarity and progressive internationalism. And that really is an approach that pays great respect and deference to the issue of the sovereignty of countries. So South Africa does not support opposition movements. It does not comment on human rights abuses. It does not comment on abuse by government. It does not serve as a champion of many ordinary Africans. And I think this is what your colleague from the DRC is largely referring to. South Africa defers, in actual fact, to the governing party. At the moment, that would be Kabila or it would be Mugabe and so on and so forth. And this is quite contrary to the spirit and the principles that are embedded in our Bill of Rights and our Constitution, where South Africa sets itself out as a champion of human rights, international law, and so on and so forth. So we have quite a contradiction here between what our Constitution says the values we should espouse, and in actual fact the way in which South Africa often acts in Africa. And this dichotomy is a source of considerable concern to many ordinary Africans, and it serves to support rulers and parties that clearly abuse state power in their own interests. And the DRC is a very good example of what's happening there. South Africa does not take a leadership position or a critical position on what's happening in the DRC. So these are challenges that I think that the ANC need to grapple with. How do they bring these two issues together? What is in our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, what we say we aspire to, and what is in the ANC policy document with regard to non-interference. And
yeah,
that's, of course,
yes, sorry, Dr. Saliers. We also are joined in studio by Mr. Kenny Mandaza. I beg your pardon, and that's the spokesperson for ZANU-PF. Good evening to you, and thanks for joining us. Maybe you can help us understand how, on the one side, the sovereignty of each country needs to be respected and honored, but as Dr. Saliers is saying, that the South African Constitution also extends further in terms of human rights abuses and also holding leaders accountable.
Thank you so much for inviting me. The sovereignty of a country is quite important, as much as other countries are also supposed to respect the sovereignty of South Africa. And in so doing, we, however, are looking at the African Renaissance, in which we are saying South Africa and any other country in Africa is now looking at the African renewal, in which the interplay of all the people or all the nationalities should be recognized in order to make sure that we bring about the inter-trade which is supposed to be there. We bring about the safe movement of people, and also given the different cultures and the diversity of the languages that are there in Africa, South Africa has a leading role that it has to play, given the magnitude of its infrastructure, the magnitude of the resources that are there, and the influx of the people that have been coming to South Africa. And until such time South Africa takes a leading role in making sure that it integrates the various economies that are there, it takes charge and they work with the other nations to make sure that they build the economies that will not allow the influx of people into South Africa, then South Africa should engage at this particular policy conference to make sure that they work hand in hand with other countries, other governments, to make sure that infrastructure is developed throughout Africa.
Okay, Mr. Mandaza, just a moment, we'll go on to the economics. I just want to touch on the issue of the quiet diplomacy, as the previous administration was criticized with regards to Zimbabwe, and whether Zimbabwe has become an Achilles heel for the ANC levy.
Well, I think it's important to note that apart from the role that South Africa has to play, you have got the African Union. The African Union had a summit in Midrand 2 years ago. And some of the resolutions adopted at that summit talk to the very same issues that he's raising. The issue that relates to economic development, issues that relates to infrastructural development, issues that relates to linkages. And obviously it requires the South African government and other governments to participate at the same level. It is also indeed worrying that there are sentiments that seek to suggest that South Africa is not playing sufficient role as expected by other role players. And I think it is up to those that are participating in the policy conference to say, how then would we develop better strategies? Because for me, the policy conference of the ANC now is not only about policies, it's about developing strategies of implementation. Because the policies that relates to economic development, international relations, all these other aspects are there. They only have to develop strategies on how best they can move the continent forward.
Okay, and what would you like to see, Mr. Katumba, in terms of a reform, or rather implementation of current policy when it comes to foreign relations within the ANC?
I think the issue of human rights and economic interest, they are interrelated. You cannot just play on economic interest like South Africa has been seen to be doing, because we have observed that these 16 years of Kabila in power, there is that imbalance. You see that there is more to gain from DRC than DRC is gaining from South Africa. Hence, you see that all those refugees comes because the management of this Congolese economy is so bad under this oppressive government that push all the Congolese out of South Africa. And then we have this experience of xenophobia. I have to emphasize that Congolese have the skills, they have the resources enough to gather for themselves. So it is high time that when talking about radical economic transformation, we need a radical, really, respect of human rights, of democracy, because it goes hand in hand. Otherwise, you have this dictatorship you have been denouncing with apartheid, this white way just taking everything for themselves. It will be like South Africa will play the same role on the African continent. It will be taking everything, all the economic benefit for itself, and leaving all the African poor. That is not a good prospect for the future. So we will see, we will wish really that along this rhetoric of radical transformation, South Africa really go implementing about the respect of human rights, of democracy, and dealing with the dictatorship, because we don't want Kabila in power.
All right, Mr. Katumba.
His terms have come to the hand.
All right, that's all the time we have, I'm afraid. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Merci beaucoup. And of course, we had on the line Dr. Jackie Saliers, Executive Director for the Institute for Security Studies. Mr. Bruno Katumba is legal advisor, and he's also with the Congolese Leaders Forum in South Africa. Kenny Mandaza is the spokesperson for ZANU-PF, and of course, Levindo, political analyst, joining us in studio. Thanks for your time. We're back after this.